This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign 90.1 FM dial.
And I am Bill Saylor, sitting in for Dave Wazzani on the board today. And even though I did this a long time,
Bill was with me for a long time, yes. And
this is your weekly discussion of things environmental with Dave. Sometimes this week and whatever Dave did. It's usually some sort of environmental discussion or local history.
A little off the cuff this week because it's been very, very busy. Yesterday was eye help, and I prepared and went out there by 9 o'clock. By 11:30, no one had arrived, and then I made some phone calls, and I found out that the bus that was supposed to come along Route 10 to 100 East, then up to Kirby and down to work with the Champaign, Havana, and Western Railroad. It was prepared to drop people at Route 10 for us and was the railroad, and then go on to Allerton. Well, somehow the bus didn't come past our place, so we waited and waited, and it didn't happen. It's not too bad.
So they all went to Allerton. So Dave was expecting volunteers to show up.
And it was no show. But it's okay. It's not easy to organize these things. But I would say one thing of bus drivers. Some bus drivers that are rural really know where you're at. But urban bus drivers don't go out into the boondocks very often. And if you give them a script, they don't necessarily read it. So sometimes they've gone to Broadlands instead of Whiteheath, which is like 60 miles in the wrong direction.
Opposite direction, yeah. It's not just.
and sometimes they come to Rantoul, and the directions say very loudly and clearly, you go up the Route 45, and you turn a little to the left on a section road, and you do not go over the railroad line. Well, the bus would go over the railroad line, and then it has to go about a long time because you've got to get to an intersection where a bus can turn around. It's not easy to turn a long bus. And then come back, and bless me, they go over the same trick again. And so that meant we had to have someone standing there. That's fair on our side of things. But really, we had written that script to where to go. And urban people are also a little afraid if they have to go downhill on a gravel road. That's not the usual thing that happens. And so we would like to see some rollover from year to year so that each iHelp group does not have to invent the wheel. It doesn't seem to happen. There should be a file cabinet somewhere or a computer base that at least knows those of us who do it regularly. So kind of glitch, but I worked out there and did things and picked seed and moved and took things that I was actually anticipating I would have 12 students to help with. But it was a good day, I think. And the Champaign, Havana, and Western Railroad, which hopes to get historic trains from Monticello into Champaign, is doing well. I visited with them. They were. I was impressed by the butt end of the Railroad Museum that Thomas Scott has been working on. The Railroad Museum owns 7 miles of railroad trackage, and then there's a Y at each end. Those Ys are like a triangle, and you can turn a train around on a Y. So they have a Y at each end, and the Y that comes towards Champaign hasn't been used yet, and it will be. But Tom Scott and crowd volunteers have taken out dead railroad ties and slid in new ones for that little stub and done survey work. There's a difference of opinion about where the end of the line is, whether it's the mileage peg or whether it's a survey mark. There's about 200 feet of difference of opinion. So that's one of the sort of glitches that you encounter with the sort of work we do with railroads. And so you have to balance the railroad with the prairie that we bought it for along the line, with the energy power line owned by Ameren, but they have a penchant to herbicide the trees, which are often non-existent. We keep the trees out because we know that they can short to especially old power lines and grids. So, but what the herbicide does is a glyphosate, and it selects for broadleaves. A good prairie has something like 110 broadleaves. We certainly don't have that sort of amount of prairie. But really, we bought that under Heartland Pathways for its biodiversity. And we've lost some of that to right under the power lines, and when it's windy, it's more than just under the power lines. And some of these chemicals are systemic, so if you've got a root or a shoot that's in the railroad corridor and it gets herbicide, then the plant loses out. So we're trying, and it's good. We have a site that has got a lot of New Jersey tea in it, and a lot of species, and a lot of insects and wildlife. So if any of you want to go out there and have a look, you go on Route 10, which is an extension of Springfield Avenue, till you get a long, slow curve, and it will indicate to you that Savoy is off to the south. Don't go into Savoy, but keep going over Camp Creek. And Camp Creek is basically a big drainage ditch. It services about 10 square miles of land, and that drains can be a banker, it can be hardly a drizzle. So our little prairie is on a railroad that comes in from the west into Champaign across Camp Creek. So just 1 mile, probably 1/4 of a mile past that Camp Creek Bridge, there's a section road. There's a white house on the one side, which is owned by the Rhodes family. And you turn in there, and there are two railroad lines. One is the main line, and one is an old interurban line. And that gives extra space. And fortunately, that hasn't been herbicided a great deal. At the other end, as you get into White Heath, there's a fortunate place where the power lines take a turn and go across country. And that area has not been herbicided, and it's alive with prairie. Has some poison ivy, and poison ivy kind of likes a little bit of shade, and some of the trees have grown up over the years. And so poison ivy does fairly well. So if you go out to those places and know what poison ivy looks like, 3 leaves, let it be. And don't be surprised if it climbs trees or dead trees and looks like a poison ivy tree. It can be that it has a stem an inch across. And yes, just be aware of it. If you get it on your clothes, wash your clothes. It can stay viable for a long time. So when you put your clothes back on again, you can surprisingly get, or not surprisingly, get poison ivy. Okay, we're in the process of re-railing that area, and I was impressed. Tom Scott is a railroad engineer. His father is also Tom Scott, Senior, and they have been working at it and gathering up steel railroad trackage, and it's put down alongside the area that we want to re-rail, but they have to put in ties first. The piece that is the stub to the railroad Y is there, but their ties were not good, so they put new ties in there. And then there's this debate about where the end of the museum is and where the start of Heartland Pathways is. The Champaign, Havana, and Western Historic Railroad has taken a lease from Heartland Pathways with the objective of getting this interaction with trains that are at the Railroad Museum, and there's Tom has his feet in the Railroad Museum too. So I was impressed by the amount of steel. It's a type of rail that weighs 90 pounds per yard, and that's what the Railroad Museum uses. It's not the world's heaviest. If you will go outside to the Canadian National, it's going to be about 135 pounds per yard. This is heavy stuff. And it's 33 feet long in sticks. Most of the Canadian National stuff is welded. So it comes on a long train and drops the track, and usually comes with set up with ties so that they can take a crane and lift it into a place where they're trying to rejuvenate. Where the Norfolk Southern and Canadian National cross, there's a diamond, and that wears easily. So if you were going to replace that, then you come with the rails with the ties on them, and you stop the rail process for the least possible time, because railroad traffic is expensive, and you put it in and pull it out and go. Knowing that, I was interested to see that at least probably 2/3 of a mile of steel trackage is ready to put in. We're waiting for opportunities to get support money for this. So this week, Tom Scott put in a proposal to the Google Foundation for $75,000 to help do some of this. And that initial move for a not-for-profit agency with a 501c3 to make a proposal. It may be a first proposal, maybe a little naive, maybe not suit the funding agency. I'm sure there will be millions of people asking for the same money, so you're not likely to get the money. But the exercise is worthwhile. You get to be known for doing what you're trying to do. And Tom's been sending around the diatribe that he sent. Has answered the questions as best he could. Some relationship to the Prairie, but basically an engineering proposal to establish a little bit of this re-rail. It's 4 miles long that Heartland Pathways owns, for 4 miles, abandoned very early before we really got to buy it. If you buy it and know what you're doing, you get the bridges. By federal mandate, there's such a fear that bridges will be a liability that they're always taken out. There's a mandate. That means you must do it. That mandate means that we lost the railroad bridge across Camp Creek. So we're busily engaged in trying to find another bridge that we can put into that site. So I was pleased to be there. I was pleased to talk to Thomas Sr. He's been here for a long time. Grew up in Elliott, up near Paxton. Had farmland there, adjacent to the railroad line. And I think they've kept their little piece of prairie on the railroad line between Paxton and Gibson City. And we got talking. We got talking about interurbans, and he spent time in Urbana, and he can relate the day when he and his father chased an interurban train across Champaign-Urbana. And then there's little stories about what was there. So when the railroad came 1.5 miles, 2 miles to the west of Champaign, probably because there's a rise and geologically it's appropriate to go there. Some towns, like Homer, moved their town to the railroad. And it was suggested that Urbana do that, but Urbana didn't do that. So then Champaign grew up as a commercial town around it, and it's continued in that way. So then you had to get people from the courthouse. Now there's a courthouse argument about whether the courthouse should be in Urbana, the old town, or in West Urbana, which is the new town. And so West Side Park was apportioned off to be a city block, and the courthouse was supposed to be there. It didn't happen. Over the years, there's been a lot of debate about the difference between Urbana and Champaign. But the courthouse remains in Urbana. So the business was there, and people from West Urbana had to get to Urbana. So they had a little horse-drawn event which has retained a bridge. There's a bridge on the Springfield on the drainage basin, and it's been preserved. That's where the horses used to go over and go to Urbana and turn around the court. And just not too long ago, they unearthed the railroad tracks in front of the courthouse. And I was trying to get them to put in plastic so that you could see this. And it was a historic monster. It didn't happen. But the railroad is still under there. And so that lasted for quite some time, until probably about 80. The mainline train went in the 50s, late 50s. And things were changing. So that little bridge operated till there was electricity, and probably middle 1850s. 1880s. You had electricity, and so you could have electrified trolley cars, and you could also have an interurban. And so the little horse-drawn track was electrified for a while, I think, but it stopped at Wright Street because Urbana didn't want to do the electric thing. So you could go past the front of the Union, and there was a gazebo, and now that gazebo has been moved around on Matthews, and it's opposite the med school or the biological area there, near where the geologists used to be and still are, near Natural History building. It's not too far from the Union, but it's there. And so we talked about this. Now, if you, in the long run, it was totally electrified, and you had a catenary. A catenary is where you have a grid above you, and there's a connection between your vehicle and the source of energy. And the source of energy has to have a little place every once in a while, like we have at Bonneville or Vizian, where you boost that. So you have a motor that runs a dynamo and gives you the electricity. Now comes the interurban. So if you want to see the interurban, it's not on that same territory. It goes through, probably the last piece of it I looked at was behind Glenpore's television. It went through Main Street, Urbana, and then along Main Street, and then it went out onto Danville.
Western Avenue. There's a little, you might think it's an alley, but it's actually a street with addresses on it.
Yes.
So if not there, it's within like half a block.
Yeah, it goes across Lincoln Avenue. You can sort of see where buildings have been built differently. You can follow it through to Champaign. If you stand at University High School and look south, there's a large building at an angle. And it belongs to the engineering department. And that's where they would bring in an engine, a steam engine, and work on it. And they had a wheel shop there. So this was the interurban.
Has that just come down?
What's that?
Has that just come down?
I don't think so, but
better look.
There's
a lot going on this summer, right there.
Yes, I know. I went up
either window replacement or
I see the buildings
of the non-orthogonal building.
Yes.
Yep.
I went up Church Street and I noticed that the school expansion has taken down buildings too.
Burnham House is down. And,
yes. So we talked about that, and we decided that Tom Scott Sr. and myself should ride around town and look at some of these places where he had followed with his father, and they could only follow it so far because the road part that they were following would disappear, and the train would go off. So interesting afternoon, and got back, and I dug up a rosinweed at Bonneville, and we'd loaded it on. We had Al Fredericks help me take it down to the 2nd Street dig and left it there. I didn't get to dig it in on Friday night or Saturday either. So Saturday night I was over there digging in the rosinweed, and I think it will survive and grow and be part of the detention pond, which is becoming to have quite a deal of character. There were people last night sitting around there talking to each other and sitting on the stones, and just I could hear the conversation while I was digging in. And I pulled the water out of the boneyard, which runs by in a stream-like manner, and you have to think about this as a flood prevention event. This is sort of a topic that I was thinking to say something about.
Are you going to say something about it right now?
Yes.
Okay, then let's say it's almost past, and you're tuned to WEFT Champaign, 90.1 FM, your community radio station. You're listening to Dave Monk, the Prairie Monk, on Sunday, September 23rd.
Yes.
Fall waited to the last second to show up with any promise of staying around this time. Beautiful day today.
So, the secondary detention pond is the result of years and years of concern. When early settlers came, they pooped in the woods. They settled in the woods. They took down the trees in the woods. The woods provided them with lumber. They provided them with protection from the storms. Those prairies out there were full of mosquitoes and malaria, and people got sick. And some of the natives would come across from Vermilion County. They knew how to grow things in the prairie, and they also used the woods. They would have fires that would surround the animals in the prairie and have an exit where the animals would actually go out, and then they'd catch them on the way out. So they'd grow their corn and melons and things like that. And then back off to Vermilion County, which had more rambunctious landscape. So we have early settlers, and then we have pit toilets. And then gradually the population grows, and we have the need for sewers. And then we have floods. And then the floods got into the sewer. So you have the sewage mixed up with the floods. And the stream can't handle it. So sometimes the sanitary material floats down the river. And then the fishermen start to wonder what's happened to their fish, because you've upset the biology of the landscape. Yeah. The biology was basically flat land. So you get areas of swampland, and they were eventually drained for very good agriculture by people from Deutschland, Friesland, people who knew how to do it in the east side of Holland and in Germany. They came here and they got the very best soils. So, but you had to drain. And how did you drain? You made a pontoon, and then you put a floating crane in the pontoon, and you followed the natural flow of the water, which did run out when it was an 8-inch rainfall. You had the water ran out, but they straightened it up so that it would be a river. If there were a large meander, they would channelize it. It goes through the neck of the meander and leave a meander scar. It would grow a little forest, and it was different, and it's interesting. We have meander scars in Busey Woods, and we have them near the Brownfield Woods and Treeless Woods. So the river was straightened so the water could flow out quickly. And you didn't allow the trees to grow and stop the flow. So now you have floodwater and you have sewage water. So the first attempts were made to try and clarify the sewage, but you had to wait for technology to come that you could do that. It's expensive to do. You have to have vats where the sewage is treated, where microorganisms will work on the material that's coming in there. You have to deal with fat that people use in their cooking. You have to deal with objects that are in the sewage, and you have to aerate to give the organism a chance to work. And then you have farmland, and farmland includes row crops, but before there were row crops, there were cattle, and there were sheep, and there were pigs. And come along with that were cesspons. So right now we're having flooding in the southeast. And one of the big concerns is that if you're in a plane and you look down, you can see pink water. So where is the pink water coming from, folks? The pink water is bacterial action on sludge ponds that are basically the feces of pigs, and the floodwaters have gotten to it. The pinkness is a sort of biodiversity that sort of melds the material. And so is there another way? Yes, you could treat it. You could have a sewage treatment plant, not only for humans, but for hogs. It's costly. So it's also costly for humans. So early on, we had an Urbana sanitary treatment plant. And you have to know that now that you have a commercial West Urbana, which becomes the Depot or Champaign, and you have East Urbana, and it got to be too small. You have to eventually let some of the sewage out into the boneyard, and goes down to the Salt Fork and into the Vermilion and into the Wabash and down to the Ohio and the Mississippi and then the Gulf, and this water is high in nitrogen from crops, and high in phosphorus and other things, and sometimes it has the industry letting out things like cyanides or other heavy metals, mercury and the like. And so what does that do to the fish? So after a rain, the fisher people find that this stuff has been washed out and they can go fish. But after a while, it goes back to normal and the fish are dead. So one indication is that we need more of an organization. And you have to have people who get together to do this. How do you straighten the river in the first place? How do you maintain that every 15 years and take out the trees? And how do you work with St. Joe and Ogden and Homer and Danville? And it requires a lot of people with a lot of knowledge. So that's why I'm talking about it now, because I find that people haven't walked on the Second Street Basin. They haven't seen what the attempt to put in prairie around the walkways, to deal with the geese and the ducks that's like the pond, to deal with the aeration, to deal with the water coming in to the pond in 8-foot high walkway drains that can handle a lot of water. Billsby has a house up there on the hill, and it used to back up. This water would back up into the basements. So now it is drained from that area coming from Champaign Moraine down through town. And there's aeration. There are pumps, and it's programmed so that it doesn't run expensively all week, but there are aeration devices, and the animals love it. And the herons are there, so they must be tiddlers or fish in the water. And there are a whole bunch of other creatures there too, if you're interested. So how do we get people together to do this? Not easy. One of the first things is that you have to educate them. They have to know about this. They have to know what it takes to design a big dig. So,
well, I do think a lot of might be sixth graders, fourth graders in this town get a tour of the wastewater treatment plant and a tour of the water treatment plant.
Yes,
sometime during their
there has
schooling.
been a fear that some of the spongy water will get into the aquifers underneath. So on North Hickory, I think there's just north of downtown Champaign, there's a room with a simulation of an underground aquifer, and the school children have put it together, and
in the Orpheum Theater.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's more than the Orpheum Theater. That's a science children's
museum.
Museum.
You're talking somewhere else.
This is where Sears Roebuck used to be, and it's, so there's, for the soil there's cardboard and paper, and for the stream there's plastic bottles, and so yes, people have learned about it, but it's essential we do that.
But I mean, they could see the real life operations,
Yeah.
so maybe later on in their adult life they'll remember. Oh yeah, we we went there. We remember the rakes to take the objects out of the storm sewer flow or whatever it is.
Yes, so there are places where pollution can come in, and that was one of the concerns that the early sanitary people had. The water would be, the underground water, which is rather pure and nice, would be destroyed. I was talking to the railroad engineers, and I'm interested that the steam engines would be filled with water at Whiteheath, which is high. And why did they do that? Because in the first place, they were down on the Sangamon River at Shady Rest. And I thought that might be, the express trains would fill up with water there. But you have to know that the river is low, and you go down to the river on a stream, and it saves you excavation. And so they do that up high, because the train had to go down and then it had to come up. And at the Salt Fork, I know a family that lived at the top, and they could tell you all the expletives that the engine drivers would say when they were hauling a train from down low, where they probably got water, to up high. And if it didn't work, they'd have to take that train apart and pull part of it into lane, and then go back, get the other one. It took all day to
Because first off, they just loaded it up with water, right?
Well, no, they loaded the steam engine with water.
So half the train.
No, they weren't loading on water. They were taking freight. So
I thought the story started when we were taking water.
But
to fill the steam engine.
Yes, it's mainly to fill the steam engine.
Yeah.
But the Scott family told me no. They thought it was probably because the water in the Sangamon was getting to be flood prone, and the junk that was going into the steam engine was not very pure. So that it would probably, the well that's on the hill at White Heath was there because of the quality of the water.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah.
So it's kind of interesting little pieces of information.
Well, like I say, if you can save yourself taking the train down the hill, then up the hill, and if you can save yourself pumping from the bottom rather than pumping from higher up.
Yes.
Those are all costs.
So in the long run, we hope to simulate the tower and the tank that used to fill the engines at the low spot. So we look for those little pieces of history. Well, thinking about all this, I started to I was very sympathetic with what's going on in the Carolinas and around with hurricane. I grew up with floods. And, I was in an area where we had an escarpment behind us. I would wake up in the morning to a 2,000-foot mountain. And we were high enough in Australia that we were near enough to the equator that we were on the fringe of tropical monsoons. So in January, it would start to rain, and that mountain would get 80 inches of rain. So we walked around in rain. It was much easier to walk with bare feet than it was to work with shoes or boots. Every once in a while we'd have Wellington boots to work with it. But it rained and you got used to rain. You wore clothes that got wet and they dried on you. You took a 3-bushel bag and you poked a doke in it and put it over your head, and that was your cloak rain. And you walked around and you'd blow water running down your nose, and it'd drip off the end, and as it accumulated a little bubble, you would blow it off. So there are just certain things that you got used to. So in order to tell you that, we probably have to say that this was a stream that ran parallel to an escarpment and then took a duck out to the Pacific Ocean. And it was taking water off these mountains. So we slept on the veranda. I would wake up. If it was very stormy, we had rolled down canvas blinds that stopped the rain from blowing in on the veranda and into your bed. When the blinds were up, you had to wait for it to dry before you rolled them up. You could see on a rainy day 14 waterfalls on the mountain alongside. And they would sparkle, and 2 or 3 of them were permanent, but the rest were just for that rainfall at that time. And when the sun came out, it was beautiful. It was there was a freshness. There was a contrast of the trees. There was the rain was still there. The moisture was still there. But then in amongst that you had the birds. The tropical birds are marvelous. We had peacocks that had long tails, where they're advertising themselves to their mates. We would have this Australian bird book, and the moment a bird like that arrived on a fence, we would be out there to figure out what it was. We had birds that created a dance area where they would dance to their mate, and they were oriented to blue. So if you had lupins in your garden and they all started to disappear, you knew that there was a bowerbird filling his bower with blue. If there were, and if you found it and walked near it, you would find it had chirps that were blue. So we were so kind of settlers in a way. My father was a school teacher, but we had cows, up to about 10 cows, in various stages of life. And we had a little farmland as well as school teaching. And my father had various disciplines, including carpentry. So we were on a hill, and the back side of the house ran into a lawn. The bottom side of the house was 7 feet off the ground, and that's where we had a carpentry shop, and so we had the cows, and we milked the cows, and they were friendly. And when it rained like this, cows don't sweat, but they have the rain washes their body, and you don't really appreciate all this reddish sort of material dropping into your milking pail. So we had a little piece of corrugated iron that we'd scratch the backs of the cows. And we got to know that they really enjoyed that back scratch. And they would stretch their head out and groan, and their tail would go up. So we kept that little piece of corrugated iron to work with our cows. But you'd have to get them in the rain, and they can enjoy the rain. They don't have to be under the cover. They're used to it. And so we'd keep the cows on the long paddock, which was the roadside right away. And after school, we'd get on a bicycle instead of a horse, and find the postman. He might have seen which way they went, and it was a tri-field area, so they could go several directions. We'd get the cows. So in that sort of atmosphere with school teaching and gravel roads, and we'd have to deal with the rain. The bull dust, which in a dry day was 3 inches deep, and you didn't know if there was a stone in there, and you'd get bruises and sometimes an abscess from standing on it, but it still didn't stop us from being barefooted. And you'd put your foot into that bull dust, and it was kind of nice to feel. So we would collect the cows. But I was thinking about flooding. And we started off, my brother and I, we found a little creek that was a creek that entered into the Bellinger River. And this we called Wishy-Washy Creek. And we dammed the Wishy-Washy Creek, which is what happens with civilizations. They dam the creeks. And we were probably destroying some of the biodiversity of the creek, but we then had a race, a long race, where the water came and it ran a mill wheel. And so that was the start of, a lot of people had creeks. Some of the creeks came off the mountain, so if it rained a lot, my father would have to send students from Little North Arm. They had to go home quickly because their way home was over a tree that was about 12 inches thick, and they had to walk London across that tree, and if it rained, it was kind of slippery. and so you would use a pole to make sure you were doing okay. So they had to get home before that river became a flooding. They did have a boat in the bushes, a flat bottom boat that you could row across if necessary. But if you did that, you had to have a strong arm because we were in the middle of currents, and so no school children could do that. So school children had to leave school immediately it rained like that. And,
you got about 10 minutes. It's
yes.
You're listening to WEFT Champaign, 90.1 FM. You're listening to Dave Monk, the Prairie Monk.
The thing when you don't have a lot of expense to put in a high-rise bridge, you put in a low-rise bridge, because it has to be low enough that the garbage that comes down, the broken trees and things, can roll over it. So we would, the mountain behind us had the 7 miles of sharp curves and deep gullies, and those people would get trapped. So they would stay with us or with a school weathershed, and we learned a lot. There was Cecil Y. Harris, who was a botanist, and she had been in these mountains looking for tropical rainforest plants, and she'd found a wheel tree. It was a sort of a shrub that was a round inflorescence which is all red, and she was so pleased she'd found it because it's a rather rare plant. And these days, like everyone else, the tropical rainforests have been destroyed for wood and agriculture, and there's not much left. So then we had other families that we still know for life as part of being there. And then when the river went down, they could depart. But in the process, we had one person who was taught us how to fish for eels and catfish. And eels and catfish are not a popular food because they don't have scales. They have the skin, and we knew how to skin it. And so Mr. Solomon and his family that was living in the weathershed taught us how to set lines that had little pieces of wire on the hook, because the eels and the catfish know how to bite the line off. So we learned a lot about just about fishing. And then people got to know that monks ate bottom feeders, was a little bit muddy in their taste, so they would bring us catfish and eels. Sometimes the eels were 3 feet long, and we knew how to fillet them so that you didn't get a million bones. Mm-hmm. Then, after getting used to that sort of atmosphere, with a sort of a coastal river that was near to the coast, my father was reappointed to Clarence River, where the escarpment was 60 miles back, and there was flat land, and it was an area for a lot of agriculture, including cane growing, and shipping would come up that river, and so the cane would be put on barges that went down to the front of the river where there were cane factories. So that was a different sort of flooding. We would have farmers who were convinced that they didn't have to get out of the floodplain that was being flooded, and we would have to rescue them from off their roof because there's this feeling that it's not going to happen to you. But getting people off of a roof of a house in flooded water was a difficult deal. I used to work with the next door beekeeper, and we would put bees on the flatlands, and those bees would be in jeopardy once the flood came. So there we were with a boat lifting hives of bees and putting them on top of a dairy barn so that they would survive. And that could be dangerous because the river was rising and there was currents, and I was not old enough to be strong enough to worked a flat-bottom boat, and in a very, I can remember the beekeeper changing places with me because he had to really work. Then the flood prevention people would put a boat, which was a wartime boat, which was amphibian, and we could see that they were searching for us with a flashlight, with a huge, because they knew that we were out there, and my mother had gotten upset, so I think she had called the prevention people. But you also had a problem with this. The river has backwaters, so you have meander scars, and the backwaters got to be filled with a European plant, and probably an English plant. It's a hyacinth, a water hyacinth, and it's really quite beautiful. And if you go swimming it, the water is pure because the roots are in there to sort of cleaning it up, and it's nice and cool.
But it's invasive.
It's tremendously invasive, right. and the floodwater comes up, and it all goes up, and then the floodwater moves, and it drops all that hyacinth material on the local farmland, and so the farmers can't stand it, they can't move it, it doesn't rot, and so if you mention hyacinths to the farmer, it's very different from someone who comes as a visitor and travels along the highway and sees this beautiful mat of hyacinths. Wow! And they start to talk about it, and then they realize that this is not the creature that they think it is. So we had some experiences with flooding, and people staying in higher spots for quite a while till the water goes down. And let me see how much time we have. We got 4 minutes.
Yeah, we do, but we should end on time for
we
once.
should say something about pledge.
Oh, we can.
Yeah,
just let you know, David was just talking about growing up in Australia in case you came in here at the last second. This is the Prairie Monk program on WEFT Champaign, 90.1 FM, your community radio station. We are still looking for donations. This is our pledge drive season here at WEFT, not just for our operations, but we also have a capital expense to, in effect, build a new antenna and move it.
Tower.
And do the bureaucratic exercise that goes along with that. Because the tower that our antenna is on presently, which we rent the space on, that tower is structurally ready to be done. So we've been asked to get off the tower soon, and that involves basically redoing the antenna. And that's an expense that we need some extra help with, and you, the listeners.
If you're curious about what WEF does as a community radio station, you should go to their website, and you'll find out a lot.
Where you can also make a donation, again, for our operations and a little bit for the $50,000 plus or minus expense that this will entail to keep WEFT on the air. It's the last piece in the chain that actually gets the signal to you and makes us an FM broadcast station. We've actually done some improvements in the chain with help from grants and again our individual donors in the past couple of years that get the signal out to that point. So things happen in the background you don't always know about.
Yes,
but this one needs to be in the foreground. We need to again kind of build a new antenna.
You need to encourage people who are experts in broadcast technology, and
we'll hire out for that. But we likely have people with enough wherewithal at WEFT here to do that, to support those things. But we need your financial support. We do indeed. This is a community radio station. We're all volunteer here. So again, WEFT.org. I have a song to lead off with. I put the Doc Watson disc back in there because I figured there was either going to be a song about catfish or about the river. No, that's somewhere in the library. Maybe not Doc Watson, but I have Deep River Blues. And
I just wanted to mention that these days dams are being taken out so that the rivers operate more naturally. Go.
All right, this has been.
Oh, you were going to put...
What? I am.
Oh,
okay. I can be able to hear it.
This is Dave Monk,
Prairie Monk,
WEFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial.
I'm Bill
Go
Saylor.
for it. Look at your landscape.
I'm Bill Saylor, sitting in for Dave Wittani today. Thank you for tuning in. Stay tuned next for 13 Music of India here on WEFT Champaign.